Thanks to all of these special experts for their participation. We'll move on in the same order as I presented their names. Kindly, every speaker has 15 minutes, and hopefully we will have 15 minutes of Q&A session at the end. So we can begin with Professor Green. Thanks a lot again. I think this works.
Is this working? You can all hear me? Great, thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a huge honor to be here amongst so many brave and courageous activists. It feels a very special moment here in Tunisia. And I want to thank the Global Sumud Flotilla, the Wallace organizers, and the Tunisian Bar Association for making this event possible, and for inviting me as a representative of the Gaza Tribunal. If I were a sailor and perhaps a little more courageous than I am, I would be joining you on a boat. But just being here, surrounded by and uplifted by the activists that I've met so far, feels like the most enormous privilege and a moment of joy, as Francesca mentioned, a moment of joy in an otherwise desperately bleak global landscape. Thank you all for your bravery, your spirit, and your humanity. The world has arrived at a very dangerous precipice. Gaza has exposed the fissures and fractures that so glaringly divide our capitalist world. It's revealed in raw brutality the gaping chasm between persecutors and persecuted, between oppressors and the oppressed, between the colonized and the colonizers, between the rich and the poor. And in doing so, Palestine has become the lightning rod for the global anti-colonial movement, for an awakening and recognition that change must come from below, must come from a newly animated civil society. My brief remarks relate to civil society law and challenging state crime, of which genocide is clearly one. As I said, I'm here representing the Gaza People's Tribunal, which stands in solidarity with the people of Palestine and the courageous people of the Sumud Flotilla. But I'm also here not as a lawyer, but as a critical scholar of state crime and as an activist. Deploying law strategically, as the wonderful Hind Rajab Foundation do in their pursuit of holidaying Israeli genocidaire, and South Africa's case against Israel at the ICJ, can all play a powerful role in the civil resistance against genocide. But imagining that the international legal order through the international courts can play anything more than a symbolic role in the struggle, I think, is deeply misguided. With respect to Palestine, Israel has breached over 30 UN Security Council resolutions without consequence, and its daily egregious international crimes have led to nothing but impunity. Israel's ongoing genocide reflects the abject failures of the UN system to prevent and punish war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And as a scholar of state crime, I can't rely on legal definitions, given that states make laws and are notoriously unwilling to define their own actions and behaviours as criminal. And so my colleague Tony Ward and I came up with what we think is a much more powerful and useful definition of state crime in which genocide features, and that is human rights violations perpetrated by state agents in pursuit of state organizational goals. For a scholar of state crime, the solutions to state crime lie well outside the frameworks of criminal justice, law, international conventions, and international courts. Instead, any such solutions are much more likely to be found in the struggles of the state's victims, or with those who advocate and organize as allies on behalf of those victims. And it's the organization of those victims and allies that not only has the power to challenge state violence, but is absolutely central in first defining and naming that violence as criminal in the first instance. Civil society has proven itself to be a much more effective force than international law in first identifying, gathering, and analysing evidence, and naming and resisting the worst crimes of states, particularly through campaigns of civil disobedience, mass strikes, and boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and the kind of actions that the Sumud Flotilla represents. Civil society enjoys widespread legitimacy as an authoritative check on the power and actions of the state. Because it operates from the ground up, it has far greater agility and capacity to recognize the processes involved in earlier stages of state crime. Genocide is not a singular, spectacularized event of violence. It's a process. It begins with structural strategies of dehumanization. It bleeds into sporadic acts of litmus testing violence against the target population. And that violence in itself can lead to isolation, ghettoization. And once that isolation takes place, it's much easier, as we've seen in the case of Gaza, to systematically weaken the population within that ghetto, within that isolated space. And once a population is weakened and isolated, then we see the annihilation phase, if we reach that phase. It's not the end. The annihilation phase is never the end of genocide. We then have a reorganization of the state which has perpetrated genocide in the absence of the people who've been erased. Why do we know about Israel's genocidal crimes? Not because our media reports on them or our governments denounce them. To the contrary, our mass media and our governments have been central in sustaining and perpetuating these crimes. We know about Israel's crimes only because for decades, Palestinian and other civil society groups globally have been documenting them, analyzing them, and reporting on them. The Israeli crimes embodied in all the stages of genocide that I mentioned have been extremely well documented by international human rights groups, by Palestinians, by independent journalists and scholars. And these crimes include the settlement movement, routine settler and IOF violence in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, house demolitions, village destruction in the Negev, forced evictions, the detention without charge of thousands of Palestinians, including many children, the apartheid structures of walls, roads, and checkpoints, which make Palestinian daily lives in the West Bank an absolute misery, discriminatory laws and the process of Judaization, not to mention the 16-year siege of Gaza, which preceded the nightmare which has followed October the 7th, 2023. Civil society has been at the heart and center of all evidence gathering in relation to Israel's crimes. And this work by civil society has led efforts to successfully name Israel's crimes as settler colonialism, as apartheid, and as genocide. The Gaza People's Tribunal is a people's tribunal in the tradition of Bertrand Russell's International War Crimes Tribunal for Vietnam and the Rome-based Permanent People's Tribunal, which grew out of it. Unlike a court of law, our tribunal, the Gaza Tribunal, begins from the premise that Israel is committing genocide, that it is a settler colonial apartheid state, underpinned by the racist ideology of Zionism. We do not require a ruling of an international court to determine that a genocide is happening and has been happening in its early stages since 1917 and the Balfour Declaration. Thousands of civil society organizations, historians, criminologists, international lawyers all agree that it is a genocide. The Gaza Tribunal project, running parallel to the existing legal procedures that you all know about in the international courts, is led by Professor Richard Falk, and its primary aims are to essentially invigorate the power of civil society in its efforts to stop the genocide, and to promote solidarity among Palestinian and global civil society activists and organizations, progressive intellectuals, and people of conscience around the world. And it's based on witness and expert testimony to create an archive of both the historical and geopolitical contexts of the genocide and the solidarity movement which it has engendered. We started from a recognition that governments and the international legal order have not simply failed the Palestinians, but they've actively enabled Israel's impunity and its decades-long colonial persecution of the people of Palestine. We are not a legal tribunal. Rather, we seek to document and give voice to Palestinian witnesses and to the movement of solidarity that has grown up around supporting the Palestinian people. For us, the challenge of justice and resistance falls to civil society, to acts of solidarity like the Sumud Flotilla, to social movements and to people of conscience everywhere. We understand the need to mobilize the power of the people in their millions to challenge the crimes of the Israeli regime and its co-conspirators, our own governments in the US, Europe, and elsewhere. The tribunal seeks to counter the forces of evil with the forces of justice by bringing pressure to bear in every sector and making clear that genocide will not be normalized, that apartheid will not be normalized, that colonialism will not be normalized, that Israel and its Zionist underpinnings will not be normalized. We know that Israel's Zionist regime is committed to seeing out this horrendous genocide. And we know that its principal genocidal partner, the United States government, is equally committed to this genocide and to the erasure of Palestine. At the same time, we know that other Western governments like the UK and Germany and complicit Arab states have fully endorsed Israeli impunity and continue to do so. So the question is, how, in the face of such powerful forces of carnage, do we stop a genocide? How do we dismantle the Zionist state and those global powers whose ultimate goal is the erasure of Palestine, knowing that law and its international mechanisms are not the whole answer, or not very much of the answer at all? The tribunal is clear. Genocide and the settler colonial apartheid regime, which has facilitated it, will only end through resistance against the regime. The steadfastness of the Palestinian people, the solidarity of the rest of the world, and the isolation, weakening, defeat, and dismantling of the Israeli regime and the global political and economic structures that support it. The flotilla, in its essence, is a marvelous example, and we very much hope that it is able to break the blockade. At the first session of the Gazan People's Tribunal held in Sarajevo in May of this year, the contextual foundations for understanding Israel's genocide were laid. Over the course of 4 days, we heard expert testimony on the history of the genocide, on the crimes that Israel has and its partners have committed, and on the geopolitics fueling the genocide. Like Bertrand Russell before us, and I quote him here, "Our task is to make mankind bear witness to these terrible crimes and to unite humanity on the side of justice." The Sarajevo Declaration, as we called it, was the culmination of the work of the tribunal to date, and you can find it on the Gaza Tribunal's website. It was a rallying cry. It embodied the demand for an immediate withdrawal of Israeli forces and an end to the genocide, to all military action by Israel, to force an end to forced displacement and expulsions, an end to settlement activities, an end to the siege of Gaza and restrictions on movement in the West Bank. It calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all Palestinian prisoners, including the thousands of Palestinian women, men, and children held in abusive Israeli detention regimes. It insists on the immediate resumption of massive humanitarian aid to all of Gaza without restriction and interference, including food, water, shelter, medical supplies and equipment, sanitary equipment, rescue equipment, and construction materials. It also calls for a complete withdrawal of all Israeli forces from Lebanese and Syrian territory. The Sarajevo Declaration recognizes that dangerous forces in both the public and private spheres are pushing us towards the abyss. The events of the past 23 months and the tribunal's own deliberations have convinced us that both key international organizations and most countries in the world, whether acting individually or collectively, have not only failed in defending the human rights of the Palestinian people and in responding to the Israeli regime's genocide in Palestine, but as I mentioned earlier, have in varying degrees been complicit in these crimes and have certainly contributed to Israel's impunity. In the declaration, amongst other things, we denounce the wave of persecution against human rights defenders, peace activists, students, academics, workers, professionals, and we honor those, like those who are participating in the flotilla, who despite this persecution have had the courage and moral conviction to stand up and speak out while rejecting the tactics of smearing us as anti-Semites or supporters of terrorism, and to all those who dare to speak up against the Israeli regime. We also reject the destructive ideology of Zionism as the official state ideology of Israel, of the forces that colonized Palestine and established the Israeli state on its ruins, and of pro-Israeli organizations and their proxies today. We demand immediate action to isolate, contain, and hold accountable the Israeli regime through universal boycott, divestment, and sanctions, a military embargo, suspension from international organizations, and the prosecution of its perpetrators. The Sarajevo Declaration ends with the following: the challenge of justice now falls to the people of conscience everywhere, to civil society and to social movements, to all of us. Palestinian lives are at stake. The international moral and legal order is at stake. We must not fail. We must not relent. Millions of people continue to march in cities around the world. Civil resistance groups non-violently target armaments factories that supply weapons to Israel. Trade unions have begun to block armament shipments to Israel. The BDS, particularly through its academic and cultural boycotts, has grown in power and impact. And a phenomenal, I don't know if this figure is right, but 26,000 at least, that was the last figure I saw, have signed up for the Sumud Flotilla. Joy, as Francesca was saying, she stole the words from me, but joy is something we tend to share only privately in these dark times. But the flotilla is a real cause for public joy because it reminds us of our collective power and of the fact that humanity lives strong amongst ordinary people of conscience. And I'd like to conclude with another quote from Bertrand Russell. In his closing address to the final session of the Vietnam War Crimes Tribunal, he declared in words that equally impel our resistance today. He was speaking about the Vietnamese, but it applies so aptly to the Palestinians. He said, "The napalm and pellet bombs, the systematic destruction of a heroic people, are a barbarous rehearsal. The starving and the suffering will no longer die in silence. We must discredit the arrogant demand that they protect our comfort with their quiet agony." Thank you.